but then you're rolling your own big custom thing, and if you're at the level where you're comfortable doing that sort of stuff, then you should just be using these bigger, more complicated things, which then comes back to the issue of where does Firebase fit in, because in order to make it usable in that way, you need to have the competency to make it usable in that way. But then if you have the competency to use it that way, you can use these bigger, more complicated things, and that's my issue with this. That's why I don't really know where to classify this and where to put this, is because I think it is good. What is going on, guys? Today it is Firebase Day. This is something I've wanted to talk about for a while, and I have quite a relationship and history with Firebase. It is the service I used to deploy and build the backend and authentication for the very first app I took to production. Back in high school, I did a website for a local restaurant. I was good friends with the owner, knew him well, and I built the site for him. I deployed it using Firebase hosting, implemented the admin page using Firebase, and I built the whole site in React, did all this stuff. It was my first real experience with any of this. But as I've grown over the years, I've sort of grown sour on Firebase. Right after that, I sort of learned about Next.js, and I got really in. I was like, holy crap, GraphQL, this is cool, what does this do? And then I built the next site entirely in GraphQL with a separate Express thing. I proxied everything through an API. It was the worst thing I have ever written, the most over-engineered garbage. Something I'll probably actually do a video breaking that down as a what not to do sort of thing, but yeah, I didn't know any better at the time. And then after that, I sort of grew, and then I started using, actually good technologies and learning how they work, and now I've gotten to a point where I'm building apps like Insider Viz, and we're using it's generally speaking the T3 type stack, and it's also got some elements external like Go, and I'm using some different services and implementing some more front-end stuff, but generally speaking, it's this TRPC, Nextauth, Prisma, PlanetScale, all this kind of thing. That's sort of where I've landed, but I wanted to go back and revisit Firebase because I have seen a bunch of people not understand it and not understand what it does and what it's for and what pieces of it really do have value, because there are pieces that do have value. So to illustrate this, I wanted to build out a little example app. Today during class, I just got bored, so wrote out a basic little to-do app in Firebase. Not the greatest thing I've ever written, it's got its issues, but I'll show you that in a second. But before I get into that, I just want to remind everybody I will be uploading something every single day throughout all of November. We are, I think, 8 days in. The growth has been absurd. Thank you for that. Hopefully things are improving, getting better, getting more coherent. I have a lot of ideas and plans for things I want to cover, things I want to talk about, but if there's anything specific you'd like me to look at or talk about, please let me know. I am constantly looking for new things to learn, talk about, mess with. I really enjoy it. So yeah, without further ado, let's break down this app. So what you're looking at right here is a React Firebase example that I built out today. It's, again, not the greatest thing, it's just a task app, nothing special, but it illustrates a lot of the basic concepts that you would need for Firebase and a lot of the things that it does for you, in particular authentication and database management. So let me go ahead and start this up, and you will see I have this really basic task demo. It's a to-do app is all it is. If we log out, I have authentication implemented, so I'll say please log in. If I hit login, can log in with my Google account. And then if we go in here and I just put in a real task, then this is a description, so, normal stuff. Hit create, we end up with this guy up here. I can then complete this. It'll say it was completed at, give me the timestamp, delete it. If I refresh the page, state is maintained. It all saves up and down from a database. Very simple. So let's get into how this is actually built. Okay, so before I talk about the actual app itself, I want to first break down how Firebase actually works and the two different parts of Firebase, which is the app SDK and the admin SDK. This is something I didn't understand for a very long time, and this led me to make some really bad architecture decisions when making my apps. So the first thing you need to understand is that the Firebase/app is all being run on the client. So that's going to be shipped down to your end user, and everything on there is going to execute on their machine. So the first thing you need to understand is what the Firebase app SDK really does. What this does is it creates a way for you to interact with Firebase services directly from the client's device. So everything inside of here does not need a server to run. And the demo I built only uses stuff in here. It's using Firestore and Firebase auth without an external web server. So that means that hosting an app using Firebase is really easy and quick, and you don't even need a backend. Most websites need some sort of backend, so that leads you to having to build out a web server or use something like Next.js or Remix where they come with a built-in web server and you can build them out that way. They come with a backend built into them, but this will allow you to use like a single page app framework like Vue or React to build a full app without your own backend, because that's what Firebase is. Firebase is backend as a service. So what you see here is that you have the Firebase app SDK, and that includes Firestore, Firebase Auth, and Firebase Storage. The app I built leverages the Firestore and the Firebase Auth, which are the database and authentication respectively. So what's interesting about this is it's not secured in the same way that a normal app is, and that's something that you definitely need to understand. This is being secured via rules. So you can go inside of the Firebase admin panel, and you can, or the Firebase console, sorry, and you can go through and you can set, okay, the only way for a user to be able to make a read or write to X collection is if they have this perm, or if they have this role, or if they're logged in, or if whatever. You can set up your access roles there, and that's extremely important because what you need to understand about this is since it's all executing on the client, if it's not secured, anyone can access and run anything. If it wasn't secured, I could update some other user's payment details without having to do anything. So it's a bit of a security issue that you need to make sure that you have those rules set up and secure before you take this to production. But it also leads to a much easier development experience because you don't have a backend. Now, Firebase does have a place in the backend, and if you need to build out a more complex backend and do really, the big example of this is Stripe. Stripe needs its own backend. You cannot run Stripe on the client because Stripe is built on webhooks, and webhooks can't be accepted by a client's device. They have to be accepted by some standalone server that's sitting at a fixed IP address with a fixed domain that will take in all of those requests, and then you use the Firebase admin SDK to then update the Firestore of the user or whatever. So say you need to fulfill a subscription that a user just made, you can then fulfill that using the Firebase admin SDK on a backend server, which Firebase actually does provide a way of doing that via the Firebase functions, which are just serverless functions that you can set up, you can build out the code for them, and then just invoke them however you want via either HTTP or cron or whatever. So all of this sounds really crazy on paper. I mean, the idea of this is you have your client-side React app where you have your authentication, you have your storage, so you have a storage bucket using Firebase storage, and then you have a built-in database using Firestore. And instead of having to make this giant complex backend to manage your database and setting up Prisma and setting up your API keys back and forth or setting up TRPC to connect them, all you have to do is just call functions on the client side and mess with the database from the client. So this sounds insanely easy and nice, so it leads to the question, okay, why doesn't everyone just do this? If this is what you can do, why not do it? And obviously, there's a catch to it. And the catch is, A, Firestore kind of sucks, and I'll show you why in a moment here. And also, this is sort of a limiting approach because you can't do as heavy of computation on the client as you can on the server. So it sort of pigeonholes you into doing more basic things. But I think that's sort of the point of Firebase, and I want to wrap that up at the end. I've kind of had a lot of trouble really boiling down how I feel about this and what I want to say here. But I think Firebase sorta does have a place, and I think it isn't as bad as people say. Okay, so at this point I want to actually break down the little app that I put together. This is obviously hosted publicly on GitHub. It's down below if you want to look at it yourself. Highly recommend taking a look through it. It's not the greatest code I've ever written. I wrote this during a lecture I was kind of bored in. Spent like an hour and a half on it, but it works, it gets the job done, and it is a very basic task app that implements authentication and reading and writing and updating to a database. So let's start out here with just the base app. Since this is a normal Create React app, it is single page, so there's no like pages and stuff like you get in Remix or Next. You just have your little app component which is rendered, so I need to have a logged in state and a logged out state. Then I have my nav bar up here, and really the only sort of weird thing in here is this use Firebase auth hook. This is a package that was written by me last summer. I was expecting to write the authentication for Insider Viz in Firebase. I was planning on using Firebase Auth for our authentication provider, but at the last second I switched over to NextAuth because I ended up deciding that, this makes more sense, it fits better with our stack, and there's no reason to pay for it when we can just put our authentication into our database for free with no real issue. And it just integrates great with Next and TRPC and all that stuff. The T3 stack is phenomenal. So I didn't end up using this, but I did end up using it today for the sake of this video, and basically what I did is I just created to work similar to any other authentication provider you would have in the React world, where you call this hook and then you get like a loading state and you also get a user. So this user is either a user object or it's null, which basically if it's null, they're not logged in. That's kind of how you check. So I just do a switch down here, logged in, log out. And then up here on the nav bar, so this guy right here just has Google sign in and log out. And then on this guy up here, all I need to do is just check whether or not they're logged in. I pass that in as a Boolean via props. And then if I need to log in, I just pass in the logout function or the Google sign in styled up down here. Nothing fancy. Then getting into the actual meat of the app and the interesting stuff, which is mostly the Firestore implementations. So I'm not going to go through this. This is a to-do app. You've seen these before. They're not special. And also, I do want to caveat that the way I built this is not ideal. I basically just set up a, where is it? I set up this like needs refetch thing. So every single time you like update the state of the app, like you delete a task, complete it, or create a new one, I will just refetch all of them from the top. That's not how you should do things. You should be using stuff like optimistic UI, updating local variables, that kind of thing to cut down on your reads and writes, because Firestore is built based on how many reads and writes you do from the database itself. So you want to keep your reads and writes as low as humanly possible. So this is not how you actually want to do it in real life, but it illustrates the concept pretty well. So first component I have up here is the task list. This is what will actually print out the tasks that you see. So at the top here, I have this fetch tasks, and that's what I want to focus on now. So what you see right here is the sort of query language you get with Firestore, and this is the reason why Firestore is not very good is because it's a document-based database, and those are pretty niche already. So if you're going to use a document-based database, use the good document-based database, and which is MongoDB. It does the same general thing, but it has aggregations, it has full-text search, it is way faster, way more performant, way better scaling, and it's not charged based off reads and writes, it's charged based off hosting it. So I would never actually use Firestore in the real world, but to illustrate this, I did. Okay, so let me go ahead and sort of illustrate how this is actually working by showing you the console itself. So one of the best things about Firebase is its online user interface. This is really intuitive and nice to work with. And what we've got right here is the collections view. So if you go back here and look at my query, I'm saying, okay, I want to get a reference to the task collection, and I want to pass that reference into the query. So I'm saying, let's get a query where I'm going into the task collection, and then I'm filtering it by where the user ID equals the user ID, because the way I map these tasks to the end user is just by using their user ID over here. So I map the user ID to the user, and then I just order them by when they were created, so just keep them in descending order. And then I call this query snapshot, and then I await getDocsQ. So then this creates a snapshot. It's not quite like a Prisma sort of thing where you'll just get exactly what you want down immediately. This will send back a document object, which is a document snapshot, which you then have to do a couple things over to then get it working. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking all of the documents that I got out. So query snapshot.docs.map. So I'm mapping over these, and then I'm turning them into this task object, which I just created an interface for so that I can keep it straight in my head, and then filling out all these fields. And the way you get this data out is you have to do doc.data. So the fields in here will come out of the .data method, and then the stuff over here will come out of the ID. The fields over here will come from .data, and then if you want to get this ID over here, you have to do .id. So it's kind of weird, and I don't know, it's not the most intuitive thing in the world to where the ID doesn't exist on the .data, but it does exist here, so then you have to merge those together for your own custom object, but it sort of works. And then, so I'm just taking these in here, and then I'm setting the task to be that, and this task is just the state that you see up here. So nothing fancy. Then I have these two fetches down here. Again, this is where it gets really not the greatest in the world. But because of React 18, when we double call our use effects, I have a ref variable in here to make sure we only call it once. So on initial load, it will fetch all the tasks to show to the end user. And then after that, whenever we need to refetch it, just whenever it needs refetch changes, we'll just check if it needs to refetch, and then if it does, it'll fetch the task, and then set it doesn't need to refetch again, so that we only refetch once. And then this is called, as I said, anytime we have a read, update, or delete. So finally, we just map out all the task cards, and I will show you a task card now. So looking at these task cards, the two most interesting things are the complete task and the delete task. This is the sort of update and delete example of this. So the first one is completing the task is really just an update example. So what you can do is you get the reference to the collection and get the reference to the document and then update the document. So you pass in the reference to the document you want, and then you pass in the data that you want to change. So I want to change completed to true, and I want to change completed at to right now. So I'm just saying new date. And then I say set needs await refetch, or set needs refetch, true. It'll refetch the whole thing. Then we have delete task, which will go through and get a reference to the task, and then just it'll get a reference to the task collection, then it'll get a reference to the document, it'll delete the document, and then refetch everything. And down here we just have basic UI. Not a UI tutorial. Feel free to take a look at it for yourself. It's nothing fancy. I wouldn't really copy it, just basic Tailwind. Then finally, I just have this logged in component down here, and this is what's being shown. It encapsulates everything. I have my task list, which is I showed you up here, and then we have the form down here. This guy in here is what actually creates the tasks. So I have this add doc method where we just, I did it a little differently. So instead of just creating like a collection ref and then creating a document ref or whatever, I create the collection ref in here. So if I had said like collection ref equals whatever and then passed in that would work as well. It's basically just passing different like return or different values into these functions, and this function returns the right value, so it works. So I'm passing in the collection of tasks, and then I'm going to add to that collection with the add doc method, and then pass in everything down here. I don't need to pass an ID, that's auto-generated. And then finally, I just set needs refetch as true, set new task to be empty, and then I have an error catch down here. That's another thing. You should always have error handling in your apps. I don't have any error handling in here, just because there's no point for a little demo like this. And then I have a please log in for when you're logged out. And then that's the sort of front end part, but then let's look at how you actually initialize the Firebase. So initializing the Firebase is done right here. So like I said earlier, Firebase is all run on the client. The client runs the Firebase, runs the methods you call here. This isn't being done on a server. There's no server involved here. So I have to create my app, and then by passing in this config, these are just environment variables. These can be exposed to the public. In fact, they have to be. They have to be shipped with your app. I just made them environment variables because I'm posting this up on GitHub, and I don't want to post random project keys up there. I'm going to delete the project after this anyway, so there's no real point in them being there. So just fill out the env with your own if you want to test this out on your own machine, which if you're interested in Firebase, I highly recommend doing. Kind of play with it yourself, but, it's up to you. Then down here, after creating the app, I just initialize an authentication instance and a database instance by doing get auth, get Firestore, then getting our Google provider, using the new Google provider, and then setting it up. So nothing too crazy here, again. And that's pretty much it. So that's an entire app that does creating, updating, and reading from a database, as well as authentication. I'm pretty sure I built the entire thing in probably about 2 hours. I built it, let's see, I started at the start of a hour and a half long lecture, and then I finished it up 20 minutes ago, and it took me about 20 minutes to finish. So yeah, I'd say in about 2 hours, I went from nothing to a pretty close to complete to-do app that I could put in full production with authentication, database. If I secured up the console, it would have full security. If I wanted to implement Stripe onto this, it would be as simple as just creating a Firebase function and then loading my Stripe in there and sending it. With all that said, I want to get into should you be using Firebase? And that's the core question I wanted to answer today. And at the end of it, I don't have as certain of an answer as I was hoping I would. This is one of those things where I think Firebase is a tool like anything. Any of these databases, any of these authentication solutions, they're just tools. They have their pros and their cons. And I think Firebase is when you really know what you're doing, and as you get better and better as a developer, you're going to have this tendency to be like, oh, I don't need Firebase anymore. That's the little kids solution. That's the beginner tutorial baby solution. But yet, this would be perfectly fine for a full production app. I know of many apps that use this in production. In fact, there are some I know what a major investing provider actually uses Firebase Auth for their authentication, and they serve to tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of users every single day. It's not a joke framework. It's not a joke backend. It's real, and it works. But the problem is it has these strange quirks and holes to it that make it borderline unusable. And the biggest one in there is Firestore. Firestore should not be used. That is one thing that I'm very confident in saying, is that outside of basic tutorials and getting your feet wet and learning basic like database stuff and web app stuff, this is not how you should be messing with your database, and this is very, very limited. This does not have a tenth of the power of MongoDB or SQL. It cannot run aggregations. It cannot do full text search. It has very limited indexing. It has very limited features. And the way you have to query it is like, it's very proprietary and unique, which obviously MongoDB is too, so that's not really an argument there. But it's not an intuitive way of messing with your database, at least compared to the other ones that I'm used to. And that's not an argument for saying it's bad. I find Rust unintuitive, but that doesn't mean that Rust is bad. That means that I am bad. So obviously, in the right hands, it could be great. And I'm not saying that you couldn't build something great with this. I'm pretty sure like Fireship built his full online store and all his like big tutorial site and all that. I think it's all in Firebase. I think he did it all with this, which is very impressive. And frankly, I can kind of see why. I do sort of get the motivation, but I also don't think that this scales. I think that one of the biggest issues that you're going to run into is messing with the database in this way. You don't end up with the type safety that you would end up with something like a Prisma, and you don't end up with the powerful aggregations you would end up with something like a MongoDB. So you're losing out on the two big benefits you get from either using like a Prisma SQL type thing or a MongoDB document type thing. And you're getting this thing where if you want to strongly type your database, you have to manually type it yourself via these query snapshots. I could definitely see this getting rolled up and turned into like a reusable function where you pass in a query snapshot and it'll take it through and make sure that it's valid. And then if it's valid, it'll return out a list of tasks. And then if it's not valid, it'll throw an error, and then you can handle that. And I could see that working. But then you're rolling your own big custom thing, and if you're at the level where you're comfortable doing that sort of stuff, then you should just be using these bigger, more complicated things, which then comes back to the issue of where does Firebase fit in, because in order to make it usable in that way, you need to have the competency to make it usable in that way. But then if you have the competency to use it that way, you can use these bigger, more complicated things, and that's my issue with this. That's why I don't really know where to classify this and where to put this, is because I think it is good. I think that when I first started, I thought it was the best because it did everything I needed, and I thought that I was setting up a server and a React app, and I was doing full backend development and all this stuff. I didn't know what I was doing, but it worked. And then I sort of got to this middle stage where I built out this huge custom Next.js app with a GraphQL Express backend that I was passing back and forth to make a basic restaurant's website and a menu page. It was absurdly over-engineered and stupid, and Firebase would have been a better solution to that problem. And then now that I'm at the point where I could leverage Firebase really well, I want to be using these bigger, more complicated solutions like PlanetScale, not PlanetScale, like a SQL database that's attached to Prisma and then underlined by something like PlanetScale that can scale really well. And I just don't know where it fits. That's the problem. So I think where Firebase fits is rapid prototyping, probably, or maybe very lightweight and quick apps. Because, I could see this working for, say, maybe if you had to do like a to-do app type, no, that's not a real thing though. You wouldn't actually build that. Any real app you build is going to at minimum have a users table, it's going to have payments, it's going to have subscriptions, it's going to have data for whatever the app actually does, and that's probably going to be 5 or 6 collections minimum from my experience. So maintaining and managing all of that with these custom interfaces and query snapshots and fixing functions and all that, it's going to get really bad really fast. So I don't know where it fits in, truthfully, and I think that especially if you're new, I wouldn't worry about this because I think that this is going to teach you the wrong lessons. And I think that the things that you should be worried about learning are how to work with a database on a real web server, not on a client effectively, and making calls to a client on there, and learning how to use this. Again, I don't want to use the word real because Firebase is real and it does work, but I guess the better word would be traditional, working on a traditional web server. The next thing that you should sort of think about with is Firebase good or not is Firebase auth. And again, I think that this is its strongest point, to be completely honest. Actually, the storage is pretty slept on. It's pretty great too. Firebase storage is really easy to work with and it's really nice. I didn't implement that to show in here, but I've used it before. It's pretty great. I think that the authentication, though, is the best because let's look at this on the console. On the sign-in methods page, if we want to add a provider, this is as easy as it gets. Setting this up custom in, like, what's it called, NextAuth or Auth0 or any of these other providers, it's pretty easy. It's not too terrible, but it's as easy as it gets here. If I want to set up GitHub, I just have to pass in the client ID and the client secret, and it'll just handle everything for me. I won't have to actually worry about I won't have to worry about doing any of the OAuth setup. I won't have to worry about the callback URL. I just paste those two things in here, and then I copy paste in this OAuth to the callback, or I pass in this callback to the OAuth configurator on GitHub, and it just works. And having 50,000 free monthly active users is pretty freaking great for an authentication provider. It does then scale up to Google Cloud pricing, which is more. And that is one thing that you're going to notice is that Firebase gets expensive. If we look down here at Firestore, it's not, you get you get a very generous free plan. And that's by design. They want you to build this out in this beautiful, easy, free ecosystem. And then as soon as you start scaling and as soon as your app starts getting users, bam, you get hit with a bill. Okay, so then you're at 6 cents per 100,000 documents, which doesn't actually sound like that much. But as your app scales up and you get bigger and bigger, this is, I guess, not a great example, but if, say, for example, I had put Insider Viz in Firestore, I would never, but if I did, I think that I look at probably at least 100,000 documents per query. I know that that's not the most normal circumstance, and it is indexed, so it is probably less than that, but it's still huge amounts per query, and every user is going to be executing dozens of queries just by being on the site. So this 6 cents is going to scale like crazy. So keep this in mind as another sort of thing to dissuade you. At the end of the day, I really don't know. I think Firebase is pretty great, and I do think it has a place, but I think that you have to decide if that place is for you. I think that Firebase, it gives you massive amounts of speed, it gives you tons of speed with no flexibility, and everything is done client side. Versus if you do everything custom, you're going to be able to scale better and cheaper, and you're going to have more customizability, but it's going to take longer. Building out the little demo that you saw here would absolutely have taken probably twice as long if I had to set everything up custom in like a Next app with a custom server and all that stuff. Granted, there are some templates that help with that, like the T3 Create T3 app or whatever. That would have made it a lot quicker, to be completely honest. But still, the fact that this went from nothing to this in 2 hours is kind of absurd. So it's something to think about. I think for those who are if you're trying to get hired, stay away from this. I don't know of any companies that use this, but if you're trying to build stuff for yourself and if you're trying to do smaller scale projects and learn, this might be a good place to start. So, I don't really know. This was very, very rambly because at the end of the day, like I said, I just don't know. I think it's good, but I think it's not the right solution for most people, but I don't want to discount it and call it trash, so it sort of just leads to this. I don't know. Let me know what you think. I might remake this at some point to try and tie it back in together. Yeah, I don't know.